Welcome back, everybody, to part two of our chapter one discussion on understanding media and culture. Here we go. Let's divide cultural periods across the world into three basic eras. One is the early modern era from about the 1400s to the 1700s, a time in the world that marked improvements in transportation, better education, and the rise of scientific inquiry. The late modern era, from the 1700s to roughly the 1900s, was the start of technical innovations, and that had a lot to do with the ability of people to create and market and brand new products and services, a rise in politics, in other words, the change away from kings and queens and things like that into more governments that relied on people who were democratically elected, and urbanization, the growth of the city, in essence. Right now, we're in what's called the postmodern age, the 1950s to the present. And this is a period where it's been marked by lots of different things, lots of changes, a rise in self-consciousness, in other words, a rise in the fact that we are here and control our destiny. A healthy dose of skepticism moved in with that. Celebration of differences, and as we have also seen and talked about already, some differences that people are not celebrating. And the digitalization of culture, and that definitely has taken place during this most common cultural period. This applies to everything from media and art and scientific inquiry throughout most of the things that we think of in our today's culture. A couple slides at least on media literacy. The older definition of media literacy was simply the ability to read and write. And, up until very recently, relatively, most people, the sign that they could read or write, or at least make a mark for their name, was considered being culturally literate. And there are still some people that's the extent of illiteracy throughout the world. In America, that's less true. And in some of the developed countries, that's less true. A newer definition that we start to use now in the days of media is the ability to decode messages from the media. In other words, you don't have to just be able to read or write. You can watch TV and listen to the words and understand them. You can look at a photojournalism essay that was done by someone in another country and understand the images because you can either equate them to your own personal experience or you can put yourself in the place of the person and the people in the pictures. So we now, with the expansion of electronic media, especially in social media in particular, and the internet, have a much broader definition of what media literacy is than we used to have for centuries ago. Couple of things here. The reason why people think that we should be culturally more literate, the positives is the theory that literate people know more, they see more, they read more, they think more, they communicate better because they're acquainted with all different forms of media, and they make more informed decisions because of all the things they now know that maybe they couldn't know in a less literate society. In other words, if you were if you were around in the 1870s or even the 1920s and you lived out on a farm or something like that, you might have a newspaper, and later on in the 20s you might have radio, but you wouldn't have the internet, you wouldn't have access to social media, you wouldn't have internet to things that hadn't been invented yet, like television, computers, and things like that. So by being exposed to more media, by definition, we should all be more literate, know more, and be able to communicate better. But when you analyze media, and that's a component of this course, one of the things you do is have to understand a little bit more than just understanding the messages. You have to delve into who created the message. Isn't that important? Finding out where the source of the information comes from. What is that person or those creators' credentials? In other words, do they have an ulterior motive? Is the message trying to get me to act or think in a certain way? Sometimes those effects are pretty subtle and kind of lost on people. Sometimes they're very blunt and straightforward, and you can tell exactly what the message is in the particular media. Is someone making money for creating this message? There are people that are making quite a bit of money putting out fake news, both websites and occasional blog entries and things like that. Is that right or is that wrong? Who is the intended audience? Is it me? Is it a broader group of people? Is it people who are someone is trying to change the opinion of a particular group or not? And how do I know this information is accurate? That's probably the biggie, and that's probably where, for better or worse, no matter how you feel, the mainstream media, the media that tries to be fair and balanced and accurate, tries to sort that issue out. What's accurate, what's not accurate, what's factual, what's not, and what's true and what's new. And truth can be in the eye of the beholder, but most people will want to have the common sense approach to knowing whether something is actually true or accurate. So when we analyze things, whether it's in a blog entry that you're going to be doing this semester, or just in thinking about these things, keep those things in mind about when you receive a message through the media, through various mediums. Ask yourself those questions and be better prepared to analyze what you're reading, what you're hearing, what you're thinking. I want to get a basic definition out here of media convergence. The basic definition is, and this was true up until just maybe 10 years ago, maybe 5 years ago even, combining two or more forms of media. Usually it was an older form with a newer form. And a prime example of that is a newspaper. Newspapers come out in print. Well, years ago they finally started adding digital sites where you can access their content online, electronically, digitally. And that was a matter of combining two forms together, one older, one newer. It's also true that television and newspapers have had these relationships where they each carry each other's content. But since then, and through discussions and theory and soul searching, most experts have come up with about 5 kinds of convergence. And the first one you're going to recognize really well because it's basically the smartphone you probably use. It's the technological convergence. Various media on one device. For example, a smartphone in which you can call people, send texts, watch movies and TV, listen to radio, and do a million other things, play games, things like that. That's a form of convergence. The organic convergence model is multitasking. Example, watching a movie while texting. Well, we think of the term multitasking, and that's been around for forever, as being able to do 2 things or 3 things at the same time, and most of us do that to some extent already. But now we're talking about using various medias to do that because there are so many different forms of media out there now that often we're doing things like listening to music while studying or watching a movie while reading a book or a magazine. It's become pretty commonplace. Cultural convergence is information flowing across different platforms. For example, novels that become TV series, and those TV series become movies. And even comic books. Batman started off as a comic, and it became a TV series, several TV series, and then it became movies. So this is what we call cultural types of convergence, where the same content flows across different platforms. The fourth one is economic convergence. This is where a company controls several products or services. For example, a single company owns a book publisher, TV networks, newspapers. This model's been around for a long time. Sometimes when some corporations have owned too much of the same product or the same kind of things, they've been slapped down by the courts and said, no, you can't own all the products or services or companies that serve the products or services for making movies, for example. So you have to let the free market rule. Global convergence is basically geographically dispersed. In other words, different kinds of cultures that are geographically, physically separate influence each other. And for example, Bollywood, which is a form of music and dance that's popular in movies, that is popular in India, course, it takes its name off of Hollywood. Um, if you've never seen a Bollywood movie, they're pretty cool. You should check one out. In Japan, recently, in the last 10 years or so, 1950s rock and roll has made a resurgence there, where teenagers dress up like 1950s rock stars and ride around looking like Elvis in pink Cadillacs and things like that. Any kind of foreign newscasts whether we're listening to the BBC here in America or we're listening to the Taliban on whatever TV station they're on, whatever network they're on. Those are all global forms of convergence. So the basic definition, actually there's 6 if you include the basic definition. So convergence is media coming together in ways in which it probably didn't come together 50 years ago. Some slides on social values and communication. First, I want to talk about what we call gatekeepers. And when we talk about gatekeepers, traditionally, these were mainstream news media deciding what information to provide to the public. For example, newspapers, again, is a good example. They get, this applies to television stations too, back in the day. They get hundreds or thousands of possible articles they can run from local staff, from wire services like Associated Press and Reuters and Agence France Presse and other wire services. And because they were trained to recognize what is newsworthy, for centuries it was up to the media, and this includes radio newscasters, TV newscasters, magazine editors, newspaper editors, to decide what you, the public, should watch or read. They are trained to sift through everything and decide, essentially, like I said, what's newsworthy and relevant. Now, that task has been more difficult to handle. There's more and more and more news being generated exponentially every year than there was since the 1940s or 50s. There's a whole flood of information. It's more difficult to trust information that comes in due to things like what we call fake news, or it's news according to me is one way to define fake news. Whether you think it's news or not doesn't matter, because to me it's news. And the public does not trust the traditional media gatekeepers to be balanced and fair. Things like newspapers don't have very high approval ratings because readers, and this is the same is true of television news and radio news, believe the mainstream media, is biased. Now, there are some mainstream media that are biased, and they're proud of it. There are also vast quantities of mainstream media that still try to be balanced and fair, regardless of whether the public believes they are or not. So those are traditional gatekeepers, and some of the problems they've been facing recently in terms of trying to be heard among all the roar of the crowd in social media and blog posts and government posts and things like that. The new gatekeepers is an era that we're in now, in which individuals themselves, like you, get to decide what information you want to consume. If you don't want to read a certain newspaper or watch a certain TV newscast or go to certain movies for whatever reason, that's up to you, because you now have your finger, you're the gatekeeper, you're the one that decides whether to keep people on your friends list in Facebook or not. You're the one that decides, well, I'm going to boycott this style of movie because of violence or sex or misogyny or whatever the reason you might have. So because we're living still in a free marketplace, we choose our news and our ideas. People, however, often do put a lot of stock into those social media internet sites as their sources. And anybody can create an internet site. Anybody can create a Wikipedia entry, and it can be filled with truth or filled with falsehoods. Anybody can pass on rumors, or anybody can pass on the truth. And there's an awful lot of both being done these days. The truth of the matter is that despite the influences that people may have or try to have on you, research has shown strongly that people tend to cling to their preconceived notions. In other words, if you believe that a certain politician should have been elected or is rightfully elected, that you're going to continue to believe that, no matter what opposition or contrary information says. If you believe one way about gun laws, it's unlikely that any form of blitz by the media or by bloggers or social activists is going to change your mind. That's what the research shows. It showed it in presidential elections. It showed it in many different types of lines of inquiry. So that's not to say that that information, that deluge of information can't be valuable, but more than ever, it's incumbent on us to kind of figure out what we want to believe and what we don't. It's more important for us to try to discern the facts and weed out opinion that doesn't seem to be justified by the facts. And that's very difficult to do. It's almost impossible to do, I think. And so you'll have to decide for yourself what you believe and what you don't believe. I would just urge you in general as a communications professional to take everything you read and see and think about with a grain of salt, and that includes traditional media. But also keep in mind the sources of things and those other questions that we asked a while back about trusting the source, verifying the information, finding out why information is being sent to you. Are people trying to change your opinion? Things like that. Now, the First Amendment is often cited as the absolute right to protected speech, and in most cases, it is an absolute protection for free speech. It does have limitations, and we're going to speak briefly about them here. Free speech and its limitations under the First Amendment, and case law. Case law is simply law that's established after a certain number of cases have been decided which tend to agree. So this is why lawyers, when they're in a courtroom, will say, I cite Minnesota versus Arizona, and they'll give a citation of a statute as a reason, as a pre-existing case that's been settled for a reason why they believe that that case should also support their case. So the truth is that people in America can, in general, speak and write what they want, but be aware there are consequences if you defame others. Defamation is a broad umbrella term for the two terms libel and slander. In general, libel is written defamation. In other words, you write something that destroys someone's character. There's a whole laundry list of things that they might be able to successfully sue you for libel. Slander tends to be spoken or broadcast defamation, but that's not always true. We're not going to get bogged down in the legal minutiae, but in general, those are two things. So you can speak and say what you want, but if you defame someone, you are liable to face the consequences if someone decides to sue you and they succeed. Other forms of speech are not protected, such as certain forms of obscenity. The Supreme Court has made some rulings on that. One of the anecdotes about one of the former Supreme Court judges' discussions on obscenity years and years ago was, I can't define obscenity, but I know it when I see it. So again, that law is in flux in local locations, state, national, but the Supreme Court has ruled on it in various cases. So some of that speech may not be protected. Dispensing information that could threaten the safety of the country is another form of speech not protected. In other words, what that usually has boiled down to is the media, usually not the media, but other forms of people printing material that gives away the location of troops in another country during a war. So example, it's not only considered treason to do that, it may not be protected speech. If you want to get on and say, well, I know that these troops are going to attack this location tomorrow, and there's 10,000 troops massed up ready to go. The enemy could intercept that, probably would these days, and stave off the attack and cause disaster. So that's something you can't always do. The oldest one, going back to the early part of the 19th century, is actually shouting fire in a crowded theater where there isn't a fire. That happened so many times that people got trampled to death that that is not a protected form of speech. If you go into a theater and yell, "Fire, there's a fire," and everybody scrambles out and people get hurt or die as a result of that, that's not protected speech. You're not allowed to say that because it causes death and or injuries. And there are some other versions of that shouting fire thing, but that's the best representation of it. Propaganda is not always forbidden by law. This is something that some people don't know. Now, in its worst forms, propaganda is commonly called the big lie. In other words, it's a bald-faced lie. It is demonstrably provable that what has been said is false. That doesn't mean that propaganda is not being used. Propaganda is used to persuade ideologically, in other words, try to get people to change their stand on political issues and beliefs, social issues, and also for commercial purposes. Often propaganda uses an emotional stance and is not supported by facts. So as you weed through media messages this semester, please take into account things that you hear or watch or read and see whether it seems to be truthful, it's supported by facts, it's not being done just to make money or to change your mind politically. It is commonly employed during wartime to build patriotism, and this has happened with a couple of exceptions. Certainly in World War I, with Uncle Sam posters and things like that, and most certainly with World War II, there's been patriotism attached to fighting those wars, and that got people to enlist, and that got wars to be carried out. That wasn't so true in Vietnam, which was among some of the American people was an unpopular conflict. Wasn't so true in Korea, and it's been true for the most part for most of the fairly recent wars we've been in Afghanistan and Iraq and against terrorism organizations. But propaganda, pumping things up to maybe you're exaggerating the truth, telling a big lie or a little lie is used to build patriotism. It's not limited to any form of media. And as a quick example, I will go ahead and use what some people call Trump's alternative facts. Again, his form of the truth. Trump does not have the market cornered on that sort of thing. Other politicians have done it too. Even Hillary Clinton in the last election did it. Told convenient lies. Public relations people good public relations practitioners don't lie, but some bad public relations companies or practitioners do. And bloggers are probably the worst at perpetuating untruths, simply passing along or inventing things that they believe to be true or that they want other people to believe are true. Well, that was it. A little shorter presentation for part 2 here. That's all we have for chapter 1. I hope you enjoyed it. It's very important that you watch all these videos because there will be occasionally some information provided in the spoken word, that it's not just on the slides or just written in the actual textbook chapter. So I hope you're taking notes and will use them to study for the test. I will see you next time. Bye-bye.